Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable appetite of Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, whose empire stretched from the Pacific to the edges of Europe, and whose dinner table was as ambitious as his battle maps. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Feeding Kublai Khan wasn't cooking. It was urban planning with extra carcasses. His palace kitchens in Khan Balik, modern Beijing, weren't some cozy medieval hearth with a pot of stew bubbling over the fire. They were sprawling, smoke-choked complexes staffed by thousands of cooks, butchers, servers, brewers, and unlucky apprentices who spent most of their lives elbow-deep in goat intestines. Picture the scene. Herds of sheep and cattle driven in daily, squealing pigs fattened just for one appearance on the royal menu, wagons groaning under sacks of rice and millet, and barrels of mare's milk fermenting in the corner like a biology experiment gone wrong. If you've ever thought running a modern restaurant was stressful, imagine that. Except your head chef is also the emperor of half the world, and the penalty for an overcooked roast is, well, not getting invited back to life. The kitchens worked like a war machine. Teams of butchers hacked through animals with the precision of soldiers, while other squads roasted entire carcasses over open pits, big enough to cook a Volkswagen. Bakers churned out endless flatbreads. Rice was boiled in vats so massive you could probably bathe in them, though no one dared try, and tea was brewed in kettles the size of small ponds. It wasn't just about quantity, though that was terrifying enough. It was about spectacle. A roast ox wasn't simply served, it was paraded out whole, glistening, skewered, and spiced until it looked less like dinner and more like a victory parade with hooves. Everything had to remind the guests, and the unfortunate cooks, that Kublai Khan's stomach was basically an extension of his empire. And then there was the smell. Imagine meat smoke, boiling grains, fermenting milk, and 10,000 sweaty workers all packed into one complex. People today complain about open-plan offices. This was an open-plan sauna of livestock, humans, and smoke that clung to your clothes and probably followed you into your nightmares. But here's the thing. It worked. The kitchens were so efficient, so relentless, that they could churn out banquets for tens of thousands on command. It was less meal prep and more culinary siege warfare. And at the center of it all sat Kublai Khan, ready to consume the results like a man who thought portion control was a personal insult. If you had 4 legs in the 13th century and wandered too close to Kublai Khan's palace, congratulations, you were probably dinner. The Great Khan's banquets weren't just meals, they were mass extinctions on a daily schedule. Sheep, goats, cattle, camels, and the occasional unlucky horse. Entire herds were raised, fattened, and funneled straight into his kitchens, like livestock fast-tracked to immortality through digestion. Mongol culture had always been meat-heavy. Out on the steppes, warriors lived on boiled mutton, dried jerky, and dairy that was equal parts nourishing and suspiciously chunky. But Kublai's table took that humble tradition and multiplied it by 1,000. What was once survival food for nomads became a grotesque buffet for an emperor. A light meal might include half a dozen roasted sheep, several oxen, and enough skewered meats to make a modern barbecue look like a sad office potluck. And these weren't delicate cuts served on porcelain. Mongols weren't fussing about bone marrow reductions or carving tenderloins with dainty knives. Animals were roasted whole, spiced heavily, and slammed down on the table with all the subtlety of a battlefield charge. Guests would rip into the meat with knives or, more often, their hands. If you wanted a drumstick, you didn't politely ask the servant. You lunged for it before someone else did. Think of it less as fine dining, and more as Game of Thrones family dinner. Horses were also on the menu, which feels mildly treasonous given that Mongols basically lived in the saddle. But for Kublai, even horses weren't sacred. A plump stallion, roasted and stuffed with spices, could be the centerpiece of a feast. Picture that on the table. your trusty war mount turned into something between a centerpiece and a cautionary tale about loyalty. Of course, this mountain of meat wasn't just about feeding Kublai's appetite. It was about feeding his image. Every roasted carcass screamed, "I control this land, these herds, and the people who raised them." When you dined with the Khan, you weren't just eating meat. You were eating a reminder that he owned both the pasture and the plate. Meat might have been the centerpiece at Kublai Khan's banquets, but grains were the glue that held everything together. Rice, millet, wheat, and noodles poured into the kitchens like tributaries feeding a very hungry river. If the animals were the show-stopping main act, grains were the relentless backup singers, always there, always filling in the silence, and occasionally carrying the whole performance when the meat ran out. Rice, in particular, symbolized Kublai's conquest of China. The Mongols had spent centuries surviving on mutton and mare's milk, but once Kublai plopped himself down on the dragon throne, he suddenly had access to the agricultural powerhouse of East Asia. Rice became more than food. It was proof that the nomadic horsemen of the steppes now controlled the most fertile paddies on earth. Nothing says, "I've conquered you," quite like turning your sacred staple into Khan's side dish. And then there were noodles. Long, stretchy and slurpable, noodles had been part of Chinese cuisine for centuries before Kublai's chefs put them on the banquet menu. Marco Polo, in his possibly exaggerated travel diary, later described them in terms that made Italians insist he had brought pasta back from China. Spoiler: he didn't invent spaghetti. He just stumbled across a people who'd already been eating noodles for 1,000 years and thought, "Yes, I will absolutely take credit for this at home." For Kublai, noodles weren't just comfort food. They were empire in edible form, strands stretched long and wide, much like his territories. Slurping them was practically symbolic. With every bite, he was consuming not just a bowl of carbs, but the farmlands, labour, and trade networks that kept his empire fed. A noodle was never just a noodle. It was a political statement, a unifying force, and also a pretty effective way to get broth stains all over your fur-lined tunic. And let's not forget millet and wheat. Millet porridge had fueled Mongol horsemen long before China entered the picture, and it still showed up on the Khan's table, usually drowned in butter or eaten alongside meat. Wheat, on the other hand, became the basis for dumplings, steamed buns, and flatbreads. All carbs, all day, every day. Keto wasn't really an option when your emperor thought balance meant 1 camel per rice bowl. If you thought salt and pepper were enough for the great Khan, think again. Kublai Khan's table was a swirling cloud of spices dragged in from every dusty caravan that rattled down the Silk Road. Pepper from India, cinnamon from Sri Lanka, nutmeg and cloves from the Maluku Islands, saffron from Persia. His feasts smelled less like a medieval kitchen and more like an international spice rack that had declared bankruptcy trying to impress him. These spices weren't just about flavour. They were edible propaganda. Each pinch of cinnamon wasn't just seasoning, it was a flex, a reminder that the Khan's reach extended across deserts, mountains, and oceans. Guests sitting at his table weren't just eating lamb seasoned with pepper. They were swallowing the fact that his empire controlled the roads that made pepper possible. If Kublai wanted you to taste submission, he'd sprinkle it right onto your roast. Of course, spices were ludicrously expensive. A handful of cloves could buy you a donkey. A sack of pepper might cost more than your entire farm. For the average peasant, seasoning meant onions, and maybe a hopeful dash of salt if you hadn't already traded it for rent. But at Kublai's palace, spices flowed like confetti. Meats were rubbed with saffron, stews thickened with ginger, and rice perfumed with cardamom. The air itself was so fragrant you probably smelled delicious just walking through the banquet hall, like an accidental human potpourri. But here's the thing. Too much spice can cover up a multitude of sins. Not every hunk of meat roasted in those kitchens was Michelin star quality. Some cuts were tough, some animals were, let's say, past their prime, and some dishes had probably sat around long enough to make modern food inspectors faint. Solution? Bury it under so much cinnamon and pepper that no one could tell the difference. Culinary brilliance or culinary crime? Depends how many horses you've roasted that week. And the symbolism didn't stop there. Spices were medicine, status, and even aphrodisiac. Nothing screams romance like saffron-scented mutton, apparently. For Kublai, every heavily seasoned dish reminded courtiers and foreign dignitaries that they weren't just tasting dinner, they were tasting empire. If there was one drink that defined Mongol culture and ruined the stomachs of foreign guests, it was airag, fermented mare's milk. Imagine someone left a carton of milk on a stable floor for a week, added a dash of fizz, a splash of alcohol, and just a hint of horse breath. Congratulations, you now have the national beverage of the Mongols. To the Mongols, airag wasn't just a drink. It was tradition, identity, and proof that lactose intolerance was a sign of weakness. Warriors swore by it, families offered it to guests, and Kublai Khan himself kept vast herds of mares just to ensure the palace had an endless supply of the stuff. It was ladled out from giant leather bags, frothy and sour, and served in silver or gold cups. Because if you're going to drink something that tastes like fizzy barnyard, at least drink it with style. Foreign dignitaries had no choice but to gulp it down. Refuse, and you risked insulting the Khan. Accept, and you risked spending the rest of the banquet clutching your intestines like they were under siege. Marco Polo politely described it as strong and nourishing, which is traveller speak for I drank it, survived, and would rather not discuss the details. Of course, the Mongols genuinely loved it. For them, it wasn't about flavour, it was about function. Airug was mildly alcoholic, refreshing, and packed with calories. Perfect for nomads who spent their lives in the saddle. It was also considered medicinal. Stomachache? Drink airug. Fever? Drink airug. Existential crisis after your village was burned down? You guessed it. Drink airug. But even by medieval standards, it was an acquired taste. The sour tang lingered on your tongue, the smell clung to your breath, and the fizz made you question what exactly was fermenting in there. Guests at Kublai's banquets were expected to toast endlessly with airag, raising cup after cup until they either passed out or forgot how much it tasted like regret. Still, the ritual mattered. Every sip was a reminder that no matter how grand Kublai's empire became, with its rice from China and spices from India, he was still, at heart, a steppe nomad who measured loyalty in shared milk. When Kublai Khan threw a banquet, it wasn't a dinner party. It was an all-consuming logistical nightmare disguised as fun. Marco Polo swore that some feasts hosted tens of thousands of guests at once. Tens of thousands. That's not a banquet. That's a small city deciding to sit down for dinner at the same time. Picture the scene. Massive silk tents stretched across courtyards, braziers blazing, musicians screeching away on lutes, and dancers twirling until they collapsed from exhaustion. Then the food arrives. Not plates, not trays, but literal herds of roasted animals. Oxen, sheep, goats, camels, carried in on spits the size of telephone poles. The smell alone probably caused fainting, or at least some guests reconsidering their religious beliefs. And the seating arrangement. Pure theatre. Kublai sat in the centre, elevated like a god with a knife, while his nobles and foreign ambassadors were scattered strategically around him. Where you sat at the table wasn't about comfort. It was a test. Close to Kublai? Congratulations, he trusts you. Or he wants to watch you closely so you don't poison his dumplings. Shoved to the edge of the tent? Enjoy your cold horse stew, you political nobody. The drinking was equally relentless. Toasts went on for hours, each one requiring gulps of airug, wine or whatever alcohol was within reach. You couldn't fake it. Try pouring your cup into the ground when the Khan wasn't looking, and congratulations. You've invented treason by spilled milk. For the servants, these banquets were torture disguised as employment. Thousands scurried around, refilling cups, carrying carcasses, and praying they didn't trip in front of the Khan. Drop a platter of lamb near Kublai's table, and you might find yourself demoted to guest of honour at the next feast, served with apples in your mouth. The real tragedy, though, was survival. After hours of gorging, the guests staggered out, bloated, drunk and sweating under layers of fur-lined robes. No medieval doctor could cure the hangover that followed, though they probably tried with leeches and prayer. At Kublai Khan's table, nothing was ever just food. Every dish was a political statement served with extra grease. A roasted lamb wasn't just dinner, it was a reminder of Mongol steppe heritage. A bowl of steaming rice, proof that China had been conquered and now cooked for him. A plate sprinkled with cloves and cinnamon. That wasn't seasoning. It was a declaration that the Silk Road bowed to his empire. In short, when you ate with Kublai, you weren't consuming calories. You were swallowing propaganda. Foreign envoys especially got the message. Imagine being a Persian merchant, travelling thousands of miles to Beijing, only to be served dishes flavoured with spices you thought were exclusive to your homeland. Surprise. The Khan has more of them than you do. The subtext was clear. Your people produce it. My people own it. And now I'm eating it in front of you. Subtle? Not exactly. Effective? Absolutely. Seating arrangements reinforce the menu's lessons. Nobles sat according to rank, and the closer you were to Kublai, the hotter your food, and the clearer the message. I like you enough to let you watch me chew. Ambassadors and visiting dignitaries got carefully curated meals, a mix of their native dishes to flatter them, and Mongol staples to remind them who was really in charge. Imagine being served your homeland's delicacies, paired with a massive platter of horse meat you were definitely expected to eat. Even beverages carried meaning. Toasting with Erig signalled respect for Mongol tradition, while imported wines flaunted global dominance. If Kublai raised his golden cup, you raised yours too. Not to join the party, but to join the empire. Refuse, and you weren't rejecting a drink. You were rejecting the Khan. That usually didn't end with a polite, no worries. The entire feast was theatre. Dancers performed between courses, musicians filled awkward silences, and every round of food was meant to impress, intimidate, or humiliate. If you were lucky, you left with your dignity intact. If you weren't, you left knowing your country's cuisine had just been downgraded to garnish. Most rulers went hunting to escape court life. Kublai Khan, however, brought the court and the kitchen with him. When he rode out onto the steppes or into the forests, it wasn't a rugged camping trip. It was a moving five-star restaurant, disguised as a military operation. His hunting expeditions were legendary. Thousands of retainers followed him, and among them, entire brigades of cooks. These weren't just guys with skewers and a campfire. They hauled portable ovens, bronze cauldrons, spice chests, and enough livestock on the hoof to stock a small petting zoo, which, unfortunately for the animals, would not be pet for long. The Mongol version of living off the land meant roasting the land's wildlife alongside the herds they brought with them, just in case nature didn't deliver on schedule. Imagine you're a cook assigned to one of these expeditions. You're trudging through mud, dragging a kitchen tent, and your job description is make roasted venison fit for the Khan while dodging arrows and wild boar. Miss the seasoning? Well, congratulations. You've just invented the career path known as ex-cook. Meals on the hunt were just as excessive as in the palace. Entire deer or wild boar would be skewered and roasted, stuffed with herbs and rice brought along in massive sacks. The Khan's tent was set up like a pop-up palace. Silk rugs, carved wooden tables, and platters of food steaming under the open sky. Think glamping, but with more dead animals and fewer Instagram filters. For Kublai, the hunt wasn't just recreation, it was propaganda in motion. Every feast reinforced Mongol identity. The Khan might sit in Beijing, sipping tea and eating dumplings, but he was still a child of the steppe, still capable of feasting in a tent with his warriors. Except his tent was the size of a cathedral, and his simple meal required 500 servants to pull off. Guests invited on these hunts quickly learned the rules. You hunted, you dined, and you toasted with Erig until your vision blurred. Declining meat after a hunt was like telling the Khan his arrows missed the target. Not advisable. If you were one of Kublai Khan's banquet guests, dessert was not the grand, sugary finale you might expect. This was not Paris with towers of pastries or Renaissance Italy. with candied fruits stacked into edible sculptures. No, dessert in Kublai's court was more of an occasional illusion, a fleeting, rare, and usually expensive afterthought. Sugar was a luxury, imported in tiny quantities along the Silk Road at a price that could bankrupt a small kingdom. For the average peasant, sugar was a rumour, a fairy tale told by merchants who liked to exaggerate. But at the Khan's table, it was a symbol. Honey, candied fruits, sesame sweets, and the occasional block of sugar, all carefully presented to show that the Khan could command sweetness itself. It wasn't about satisfying a sweet tooth. It was about making dessert into a political weapon. The irony, of course, was that most of these sweets weren't what we'd call desserts today. A typical after-meal treat might be nuts coated in honey, dried apricots from Central Asia, or little cakes made from rice flour and sesame. To foreign envoys used to hearty pies or cheese boards, this probably felt like being served the snack section of an airport kiosk. But you smiled. You ate the sticky apricot, and you nodded approvingly while wondering if your dental health had just been permanently compromised. And then there was the problem of scarcity. Spices, meat, and wine flowed like rivers at Kublai's banquets. Dessert? That came in trickles. Only a select few dishes appeared, and they were often gone before the servants reached the outer tables. If you were seated too far from the Khan, your dessert course might be staring longingly at the golden plate of candied almonds vanishing into someone else's mouth. But for Kublai, scarcity was the point. Meat showed abundance. Dessert showed exclusivity. Anyone could slaughter a sheep. Not everyone could conjure sugar from across the known world. Sweets at his table weren't there to please the crowd. They were there to remind you that he could afford pleasures you could only dream about. If there was one thing Kublai Khan understood besides conquest and overeating, it was drinking. His banquets were less about pairing wine with dinner and more about drowning entire armies of guests in alcohol until they either pledged loyalty or passed out under the table. The star of the show was, of course, airag, fermented mare's milk. Frothy, sour, and fizzy in all the wrong ways, it was poured endlessly, each toast accompanied by the expectation that you'd gulp it like it was nectar of the gods. Except it wasn't nectar. It was horse milk that had been bullied by yeast. Foreign dignitaries smiled bravely as they drank it, silently wondering if vomiting in front of the Khan was punishable by death. Answer: probably. But airag was just the beginning. Thanks to the Silk Road, the Khan's court had access to a smorgasbord of drinks. Wine caravans arrived from Persia and Central Asia, carried in barrels that had probably seen more dust storms than vineyards. Beer trickled in from northern China, foamy and earthy, brewed in massive vats. And tea, elegant, calming tea from southern China, was poured for moments when Kublai pretended to be refined, which wasn't often. The real dilemma wasn't what to drink, but how much. Banquet etiquette demanded endless toasts. To the Khan, to your ancestors, to the empire, to the person sitting 3 seats down, whose name you couldn't remember. Refusing to drink was like refusing to breathe. Accepting meant your liver was being drafted into a war it could not win. Of course, moderation was not a Mongol virtue. Guests were expected to keep pace with the Khan, who could put away astonishing quantities of alcohol and still look like he was considering dessert. Foreigners often ended the night slumped in corners, praying for death, while Mongol nobles cheerfully kept drinking until dawn. Survival tip: if you didn't want to embarrass yourself, you learned how to discreetly spill half your drink on the ground and hope no one noticed. Spoiler: someone always noticed. If you've ever complained about someone double-dipping at a party, congratulations, you would not have survived a single banquet at Kublai Khan's court. Hygiene wasn't just optional, it was practically non-existent. Thousands of guests, mountains of greasy meat, rivers of drink, and not a napkin in sight. Forks? Forget it. Chopsticks existed in China, sure, but the Mongols weren't exactly fine dining enthusiasts. Most guests just dug in with knives and fingers, wiping grease on their sleeves, the floor, or, if you were unlucky, your neighbour's robe. By the end of the night, the banquet hall looked less like a dining space and more like the aftermath of a food fight involving livestock. The concept of clean hands before eating was about as popular as salad. Servants sometimes brought out bowls of water for rinsing, but these quickly turned into communal soup of grime, fat, and whatever disease your neighbour was brewing that week. You didn't wash so much as baptize your hands in other people's germs. As for the serving style, well, let's just say food safety wasn't a priority. Roasted animals were hacked apart in the middle of the hall with cleavers, chunks flying in every direction. Meat sat around for hours before being brought to the outer tables. By the time it reached you, it was lukewarm, questionable, and very possibly auditioning for a new life as a petri dish. Did anyone care? Not really. It was seasoned with enough spices and wine to burn through the bacteria. Probably. Dogs roamed the feast freely, snapping up scraps under the tables. On one hand, this was efficient waste management. On the other, it meant that while you gnawed on a mutton bone, a stray hound was licking your boots for dessert. And don't even think about complaining. Those dogs probably had more diplomatic immunity than you did. Still, hygiene wasn't the point. The banquet was theatre, not sanitation. Kublai didn't need you to feel comfortable. He needed you to feel overwhelmed. Grease on your chin, wine on your robe, questionable meat in your stomach. That was all part of the message. You were now inside the empire, for better or worse. If TripAdvisor had existed in the 13th century, Marco Polo would have been its most passive-aggressive reviewer. Instead, we got The Travels of Marco Polo, essentially the world's first over-the-top food blog, written by a Venetian merchant who stumbled into Kublai Khan's court and couldn't stop talking about what he ate. Marco described the Khan's banquets in breathless detail. Endless rivers of wine, mountains of meat, and dining halls so vast they made cathedrals look like broom closets. According to him, Kublai had tens of thousands of servants, each with a precise role from slicing roast oxen to carrying delicate porcelain cups. Was Polo exaggerating? Almost certainly. Did it matter? Not really, because exaggeration is the soul of travel writing, especially when your audience back home has never left Venice. Take, for example, his claim that Kublai could feed 40,000 people in a single sitting. 40,000. That's less of a dinner party and more of a medieval Coachella with better outfits and fewer questionable mushrooms. Could it have happened? Maybe. Did Marco embellish the numbers to impress his readers? Definitely. But it worked. He made the Khan's feast sound less like meals and more like miracles. Marco also waxed poetic about the sheer organisation of it all. Coloured robes to mark rank, carefully arranged seating, food delivered with clockwork precision, like some kind of medieval Mongol Disneyland for the upper class. But hidden in his awe was probably a healthy dose of terror. Imagine being a guest, trying to gnaw on horse meat with greasy fingers, while writing mental notes like, "Must remember, do not offend man who owns most of Asia." The funniest part is how Polo glossed over the less appetizing details. He didn't dwell on the hygiene situation, the dogs under the tables, or the fermented mare's milk that probably had him sprinting for the nearest bush after dinner. Instead, he stuck to the grandeur, gold cups, silk tents, rare spices. He knew his Venetian audience didn't want the truth, they wanted spectacle. If you think working in a modern kitchen is stressful, spare a thought for the poor souls who cooked for Kublai Khan. Gordon Ramsay might scream at you for overcooked beef, but Kublai's solution was simpler. Burn the chef along with the roast. Culinary failure wasn't just bad for your career, it was bad for your life expectancy. The palace kitchens were staffed by armies of cooks, butchers, brewers, and servers, all organised with military precision. Everyone had a role. One group chopped, another roasted, another stirred massive cauldrons of rice big enough to drown in. Yet despite all this manpower, the pressure never eased. Because no matter how many oxen you roasted or dumplings you steamed, the great Khan still expected perfection. And perfection for Kublai meant food that could impress a man who'd already conquered half the known world. Imagine being the guy in charge of seasoning. Too much salt? You've just insulted the Khan. Too little? You've insulted the Khan. Perfect balance? Congratulations, you get to live another day. The margin of error was about as thin as the noodles they served, and the penalty for failure wasn't a bad Yelp review. It was an unmarked grave. And the workload? Brutal. Cooks didn't get breaks during banquets. They worked like soldiers in battle. Herds of animals were slaughtered and dressed at lightning speed. Ovens roared non-stop, and servants sprinted back and forth carrying trays heavy enough to crush a lesser man. One slip, one dropped platter of lamb, and you weren't just clumsy. You were disposable. Even worse, the kitchens weren't kitchens so much as furnaces. Imagine hundreds of open fires, boiling pots, greasy smoke curling through the air, and the constant screaming of supervisors trying to make sure dinner didn't collapse into chaos. If you survived the burns, the smoke inhalation, and the sheer exhaustion, you still had to worry about serving a dish that wouldn't displease the Khan's famously picky palate. But here's the kicker. Nobody praised the cooks. The credit for every feast went to Kublai himself, as if he had personally spiced the lamb and brewed the wine. The cooks, invisible. Until, of course, something went wrong. Then suddenly, everyone remembered their names, just long enough to order their execution. Feeding Kublai Khan wasn't just about stuffing one emperor's bottomless stomach. It was about feeding an empire that spanned from Korea to Persia. His dinner table was less of a dining arrangement and more of a census report, with every dish representing a conquered people or a subdued trade route. Think about the logistics. To keep the palace kitchens running, entire regions were effectively turned into supply chains. Chinese farmers shipped rice and tea by the ton. Central Asian herders drove endless lines of sheep and horses toward the capital, knowing full well their animals were headed straight for the spit. Persian caravans rolled in with wines and dried fruits, while merchants from India lugged in spices worth their weight in silver. Even ice was carved out of mountains, hauled down in blocks, and stored in underground pits so the Khan could sip chilled drinks in summer, because nothing screams absolute power like demanding winter in July, and the scale was staggering. Some accounts suggest that the kitchens slaughtered hundreds of animals every single day. Entire granaries were emptied to produce a single banquet. The average Mongol soldier on campaign survived on dried meat and hard cheese, but at court, the Khan ate like a dozen armies combined. The contradiction was deliberate. While soldiers proved Mongol toughness in the field, the Khan proved Mongol dominance by gorging on the bounty of his empire. The system wasn't exactly sustainable. Moving that much food required armies of labourers, fleets of carts and rivers of silver. But that was the point, to show the world that Kublai could bend economies to his appetite. When he feasted on Persian dates, it wasn't about the fruit. It was about reminding everyone that the trade route belonged to him, and that somewhere, a farmer thousands of miles away was indirectly feeding the Khan. Meanwhile, peasants who produced all this abundance often lived on watery porridge and stale bread. Their role in the system was simple: grow it, ship it, and never expect to taste it. Kublai's table was a one-way street. Food flowed in, but nothing flowed back out except scraps for dogs and the faint hope that the empire might stay stable another year. By the time you reached the end of a banquet with Kublai Khan, you weren't so much full as spiritually defeated. The table groaned under the weight of roasted oxen, mountains of rice, rivers of alcohol, and desserts rare enough to bankrupt a city. You, meanwhile, groaned under the weight of having been force-fed loyalty in edible form. The last bite wasn't really about food. It was about survival. If you were lucky, you made it through without insulting the Khan, spilling a drink, or choking on a chunk of mutton while he watched. Imagine dying at the banquet. People would talk. He couldn't handle the lamb is not the legacy you want. For Kublai, though, the end of the feast was pure theatre. He didn't just eat to satisfy hunger, he ate to display power. Every bite he took reminded guests that his empire stretched far enough to supply delicacies from 3 continents. Every sip reminded them that even nature itself, ice in summer, sugar in winter, bowed to his will. The banquet was never over when the food was gone. It was over when the Khan decided everyone had seen enough of his dominance disguised as digestion. And what happened after? The guests stumbled away drunk, sweaty, and mildly traumatized, while the kitchens began cleaning up the carnage. Piles of bones, spilled wine, and scraps licked clean by palace dogs. The cooks, exhausted and terrified, prepared to do it all again tomorrow. Because feeding Kublai Khan wasn't an event, it was a full-time occupation that only ended when you did. In a way, the Khan's appetite mirrored his empire, vast, relentless, and always hungry for more. He devoured resources like he devoured roasted lambs, leaving behind the bones of conquered territories and the faint memory of abundance. And just like his empire, his feasts could never truly be satisfied. There was always another dish, another drink, another conquered land to swallow whole, so the last bite was never really the last. It was just a pause, a temporary ceasefire in the daily war between appetite and supply. For his cooks, it was a sigh of relief. For his guests, it was survival. For the Khan, it was simply another reminder that even the act of eating could be an empire-sized performance. Hürrem Sultan's story begins not in the gilded halls of Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, but in a far more brutal setting, on the steppes of Eastern Europe. Born around 1502 in the lands of what is today Ukraine, she was known by her Christian name, Alexandra or Anastasia, depending on which chronicler you trust. Her childhood would have been ordinary enough, tending to fields, learning prayers, and perhaps imagining the kind of modest life that most girls in her village would inherit. That quiet trajectory ended abruptly when raiders swept through her homeland. The Crimean Tatars, who supplied the Ottoman slave markets, captured her during one of their infamous raids. In an instant, the laughter of a village girl was replaced by the screams of captives chained together and marched south toward the Black Sea. She was transported across the waters and delivered into the slave markets of Constantinople, where human lives were priced like silks or spices. For many, this would have been the end of hope, a future condemned to drudgery or anonymity. Yet for Alexandra, fate, or perhaps her own resilience, had other plans. Purchased and delivered into the imperial harem, she entered the mysterious and tightly controlled world behind the palace walls. Here, hundreds of concubines lived in a complex hierarchy, each hoping to catch the eye of the Sultan, or at least secure a position that meant safety and stability. For a foreign girl, stripped of family and homeland, it must have been both terrifying and bewildering. She was renamed Hürrem, meaning the cheerful one, in Persian and Turkish, a name that seemed almost ironic given the circumstances, but perhaps reflected her ability to smile and charm, even in the darkest conditions. In the Ottoman harem, beauty alone was never enough. Wit, intelligence, and the ability to navigate endless intrigue determined who survived and who faded into obscurity. Hürrem quickly distinguished herself. Where others might sulk in despair, she radiated energy. Where rivals whispered, she laughed. And when Suleiman, the heir to the empire, noticed her, it wasn't just her red hair or fair skin that caught his attention. It was the spark of ambition burning beneath the surface. Thus began the unlikely rise of a girl who had once been a prisoner of war, thrust into the very heart of the world's most powerful empire. By the time Hürrem Sultan arrived in the imperial harem, Suleiman the Magnificent had already inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520. He was young, ambitious, and determined to surpass his ancestors. Hundreds of women from across the empire competed for his attention, each armed with beauty, wit, or the quiet patience to wait for their moment. For most, that moment never came. But Hürrem was different. She refused to remain invisible. Unlike many concubines who were trained to be submissive and silent, Hürrem exuded confidence. Her laughter, rare and risky in the tense world of palace politics, echoed down marble corridors. She spoke with boldness, teased with daring, and seemed utterly unafraid of rank or consequence. For a man like Suleiman, who was constantly surrounded by flatterers and schemers, this audacity was refreshing. She became not just another ornament of the harem, but a presence impossible to ignore. Their first encounters are described by chroniclers as electric. Suleiman was captivated by her wit, her humour, and her intelligence. More than a mere beauty, she could hold his gaze with conversation as much as with her eyes. In a palace where most concubines were instructed never to overstep, Hürrem leaned forward instead of shrinking back. Her charm was not meek, it was magnetic. Of course, her rise caused immediate resentment. Mahidevran Sultan, Suleiman's chief consort and the mother of his eldest son, saw her position threatened by this foreign upstart. Jealousy boiled over into open hostility, culminating in what later sources describe as violent quarrels within the harem. In one notorious incident, Mahidevran allegedly attacked Hürrem, scratching her face. When Suleiman noticed the wounds, his sympathy only deepened. He punished Mahidevran and began favouring Hürrem more openly. This was a turning point. The young concubine from Ukraine had not only caught the eye of the world's most powerful man, but had also proven her ability to survive the venomous rivalries of palace life. Soon she bore him children, sons and daughters who secured her place in the dynasty. Each birth tightened her grip on Suleiman's heart and on the politics of the empire. What began as a daring laugh in a slave market had now transformed into a love story that would shake the foundations of the Ottoman order. Hürrem was no longer a mere concubine. She was on the path to becoming something unprecedented. For centuries, the Ottoman dynasty had maintained a rigid tradition. Sultans took concubines, not wives. Legal marriage was rare, avoided deliberately so that no single woman could gain too much influence. Children of concubines were considered legitimate heirs, and this system kept the succession fluid, preventing any one consort from dominating court politics. That was the rule, until Hürrem Sultan shattered it. Suleiman's attachment to her only deepened as the years passed. She was not content to remain merely his favourite. She sought permanence in a world built on uncertainty. Each child she bore bound her closer to the throne. By the mid-1520s, she had already given Suleiman multiple sons, including Mehmed, Selim and Bayezid, each a potential heir to the empire. Her presence was no passing fancy. She was shaping the dynasty's future. But it wasn't just motherhood that secured her influence. Hürrem proved herself indispensable as a confidant. Suleiman trusted her judgment, sought her counsel, and allowed her a voice that no concubine had ever wielded. Chroniclers whispered of the hours he spent in her chambers, discussing matters of state as if she were a vizier rather than a slave-turned consort. What began as affection had evolved into partnership. The true shock came in 1534, when Suleiman broke precedent and married Hürrem in a public legal ceremony. The empire gasped. Never before had an Ottoman sultan taken a harem concubine as his lawful wife. European ambassadors in Constantinople rushed to report the scandal, calling her Roxolana, after her Ruthenian origins, and speculating endlessly about her hold over him. This marriage transformed her status completely. She was no longer just Hürrem the favourite. She became Hürrem Sultan, legally recognised, sharing in Suleiman's legitimacy. Rivals in the harem seethed, the court elite muttered in outrage, and foreign observers marvelled at how a captive girl from Ukraine had bent the world's most powerful ruler to her will. The marriage also marked the beginning of a new Ottoman reality. With Hürrem's elevation, the influence of the harem became more visible than ever. No longer confined to whispered intrigues behind silken screens, the voice of a woman now shaped imperial policy, diplomacy, and succession. In choosing Hürrem, Suleiman broke centuries of tradition, but in doing so, he also ensured that her story would echo far beyond the palace walls. Hürrem Sultan's unprecedented rise did not come without enemies. The Ottoman harem was more than a collection of concubines. It was a battleground of influence, where every smile concealed calculation and every friendship hid a potential betrayal. By marrying Suleiman, Hürrem had vaulted above every rival, but that also meant she was surrounded by daggers, some metaphorical, others quite real. Her fiercest rival remained Mahidevran, Suleiman's former chief consort, and the mother of his eldest son, Mustafa. For years, Mustafa had been seen as the natural heir to the throne, strong, capable, and popular with both the army and the court. Mahidevran placed all her hopes on him, and his very existence threatened Hürrem's children. The two women clashed repeatedly, with Hürrem's sharp wit often proving deadlier than Mahidevran's open hostility. The harem itself became divided into factions, whispering loyalties coiling around the fate of the dynasty. But Hürrem's ambitions reached beyond the private chambers. She forged alliances with key court officials, most notably the Grand Vizier Rustem Pasha, who would later become her son-in-law. Together they created a political network that extended far beyond silken cushions and perfumed gardens. While rivals dismissed her as a manipulative foreigner, she was quietly weaving a web of influence that touched every corner of the empire. Still, danger loomed. Many in the court despised her for her origins, calling her an outsider who had bewitched the Sultan. Foreign ambassadors wrote letters dripping with suspicion, suggesting sorcery, witchcraft, or even poison. To them, it was inconceivable that a woman could rise so high through intelligence, charm, and sheer willpower alone. For her, these rumors were both curse and shield. She leaned into her reputation, allowing fear to do the work of 100 guards. At the heart of the intrigue was the question of succession. Would Mustafa, the warrior son of Mahidevran, ascend the throne? Or would one of Hürrem's children replace him? Every banquet, every military campaign, every whisper in the corridors seemed to circle back to this question. For Hürrem, it wasn't just palace drama. It was survival. And so the once captive girl from Ukraine became the empire's most formidable strategist, not with sword or armor, but with letters, alliances, and her unshakable ability to turn enemies into stepping stones. By the mid-16th century, Hürrem Sultan was no longer merely a palace figure. She had become a force in imperial politics and diplomacy. Her influence reached far beyond the gilded lattice of the harem, flowing into the veins of Ottoman governance itself. Suleiman's ministers quickly learned that matters discussed in the Sultan's council might also be weighed later in the quiet intimacy of Hürrem's chambers. And Hürrem, ever the strategist, knew how to use this access. One of her boldest moves was her direct engagement in diplomacy. She corresponded with foreign monarchs, most famously King Sigismund II Augustus of Poland, from the very region of her birth. Her letters, written in polished Ottoman Turkish, carried not only words of friendship, but also the implicit message that she was more than a consort. She was a political partner. This was revolutionary. Few European queens, let alone Ottoman sultanas, wielded such penmanship on the international stage. At the same time, Hürrem carefully built a public image rooted in piety and generosity. In Islamic tradition, rulers and their families were expected to sponsor charitable works, mosques, schools, baths, and soup kitchens to provide for the poor and elevate their own spiritual standing. Hürrem embraced this duty with zeal. She commissioned the Hasaki Hürrem Sultan complex in Istanbul, complete with a mosque, a hospital, and a soup kitchen that fed hundreds daily. For the common people, she was not just a shadowy figure of palace intrigue, but a visible benefactor. Her projects stretched as far as Jerusalem, where she funded the construction of public baths and the restoration of aqueducts. These works were not just displays of piety, they were also tools of politics, tying her name to the spiritual heart of the empire and cementing her legitimacy as Suleiman's chosen partner. In the eyes of many, Hürrem had transformed from foreign captive to mother of the empire's welfare. Yet even this generosity carried political weight. By funding religious and civic projects, Hürrem created loyalty among the populace, a loyalty that acted as insurance against the hostility she faced at court. To her rivals, she was a schemer. To the people, she was the Sultan's wife, who put bread on their tables and water in their fountains. In the dance of power, few moves were as subtle and effective as charity. Hürrem understood this well, and wielded it like a seasoned diplomat wields treaties. The greatest storm of Hürrem Sultan's life revolved around a single question: who would inherit Suleiman's throne? For decades, Ottoman tradition encouraged brutal rivalries among the Sultan's sons, with brothers competing, and often killing one another, for the right to rule. By the 1540s, the empire had two clear contenders. On one side stood Prince Mustafa, the eldest son of Suleiman and Mahidevran. On the other were Hürrem's sons, Mehmed, Selim, and Bayezid. Mustafa seemed unbeatable. Handsome, charismatic, and a proven military leader, he commanded the loyalty of the Janissaries and the admiration of the people. Soldiers whispered his name with devotion, and the court elite often looked at him as Suleiman's natural successor. For Hürrem, this was a nightmare. If Mustafa became sultan, her own sons' lives would be forfeit. Ottoman custom dictated that rival princes be executed to prevent civil war. Her survival, and that of her children, depended on Mustafa's downfall. The struggle for succession unfolded like a long, tense chess match. Hürrem and her allies, particularly her son-in-law Grand Vizier Rustam Pasha, began to poison Suleiman's mind with suspicions. They portrayed Mustafa not as a loyal son, but as an ambitious rival who might one day overthrow his father. Letters, rumours, and whispers circulated, some genuine, others manufactured. Whether by design or by paranoia, Suleiman began to fear Mustafa's growing popularity. The decisive moment came in 1553 during the Sultan's campaign in Persia. Mustafa was summoned to his father's tent, expecting recognition and perhaps even a chance to command. Instead, he walked into a trap. Guards seized him, and before the army's eyes, the prince was strangled with a bowstring, a grim, silent death reserved for Ottoman royalty. The empire reeled in shock. Many soldiers wept openly, mourning the man they had hoped would be their future ruler. Mahidevran, devastated, was cast into obscurity. For Hürrem, it was both a victory and a curse. She had secured the path for her own sons, but the blood of Mustafa stained her legacy. Even centuries later, chroniclers debate the extent of her role in his death. Was she the mastermind, or merely an opportunist in a system already designed for fratricide? Regardless, one fact was clear. With Mustafa gone, the future of the Ottoman dynasty now belonged to Hürrem's children. By the time the dust of succession settled, Hürrem Sultan was no longer just a wife, nor merely the mother of princes. She had become Suleiman's partner in governance, an unheard-of position for a woman in Ottoman history. While the Sultan's viziers met him in the council chamber, Hürrem spoke with him in private, often influencing his decisions before they were formally discussed. Foreign ambassadors were among the first to notice her reach. Letters sent to European courts frequently mentioned Roxelana as a figure who shaped imperial policy. They described her as cunning, persuasive, and above all, inseparable from the Sultan's inner circle. Some claimed she manipulated Suleiman with charms and spells. Others grudgingly admitted she was simply intelligent, ambitious, and shrewd. Either way, the West understood that ignoring her was a diplomatic mistake. Her influence was visible in the alliances the empire forged. When conflicts brewed between the Ottomans and European powers, Hürrem's correspondence and quiet interventions often softened or redirected Suleiman's stance. She acted as a bridge between the palace and foreign rulers, blending political maneuvering with personal charisma. In many ways, she blurred the line between consort and stateswoman, but her governance extended beyond diplomacy. Hürrem was deeply invested in maintaining Suleiman's stability at home. She encouraged him to lean on loyalists like her son-in-law, Rustam Pasha, ensuring that her faction remained strong within the imperial court. With Rustam as Grand Vizier, Hürrem's voice effectively echoed in the very heart of state decision-making. Not everyone celebrated this. Many Ottoman elites resented her power, seeing it as a distortion of tradition. A sultana interfering in matters of empire was scandal enough. Doing so as a former slave girl from Ukraine was unbearable for those who clung to aristocratic pride. Yet time and again, Hürrem proved herself indispensable. Suleiman trusted her with state secrets, relied on her counsel in matters of war and peace, and valued her perspective when balancing the empire's many factions. Her presence gave Suleiman something rare for a ruler surrounded by flatterers and opportunists: honest partnership. Together, they crafted an image of an imperial couple, an emperor and his legal wife, working in tandem, not unlike the crowned heads of Europe. For the first time in Ottoman history, the empire's destiny was being shaped not just by a sultan, but by his queen. By the early 1550s, Hürrem Sultan had reached the height of her power. She was Suleiman's legal wife, the mother of his surviving heirs, and a recognized figure in diplomacy and statecraft. Yet even for the most formidable of sultanas, time proved undefeated. The years of stress, childbirth, and political maneuvering began to take their toll. Accounts from the palace describe her suffering from bouts of illness that left her weaker than before, though never diminished in spirit. Still, she continued her work. Even as her health declined, she oversaw her charitable foundations, ensuring that her complexes in Istanbul, Mecca, and Jerusalem were properly funded and maintained. These endowments were more than monuments of piety. They were living symbols of her legacy, feeding the hungry, housing the poor, and providing water and medicine long after she would be gone. For a woman who began her life in captivity, the thought of leaving permanent institutions must have been a source of pride. Her relationship with Suleiman deepened as well. By then, the Sultan was aging, scarred by decades of war and the emotional weight of his son Mustafa's death. Hürrem became his constant companion, offering both comfort and counsel. Chroniclers note that she remained by his side not just as a wife, but as a trusted partner until her final days. It was an unusual display of affection in a world where sultans often distanced themselves from their consorts once they had borne sons. Suleiman never set her aside, proving that their bond was something extraordinary in Ottoman history. In 1558, Hürrem Sultan died in Istanbul at around 56 years of age. Her passing shook the palace, though her enemies likely breathed sighs of relief. Suleiman, however, was devastated. He ordered that she be buried in a grand mausoleum adjacent to his own mosque complex, a site usually reserved for the most honoured of rulers. Even in death, she remained at his side, forever bound to the man and the empire she had transformed. Though gone, her influence lingered. Her sons would inherit her ambitions, her charities would outlive her, and her story, of a captive girl who rose to queenly power, became legend. To some, she was a schemer who spilled royal blood. To others, she was the mother of an empire. To history, she was both. Hürrem Sultan's death in 1558 did not end her story. It only began its retelling. Few women in Ottoman history left such a complicated and enduring legacy. To her supporters, she was a visionary, a queen who transformed the empire's traditions and carved a place for women in the highest echelons of power. To her critics, she was a manipulative foreigner whose ambition brought bloodshed and altered the natural course of succession. Both views, paradoxically, are true. In the Ottoman world, her role signalled the dawn of what historians later called the Sultanate of Women, a period when imperial consorts, mothers, and daughters wielded unprecedented influence over politics. Hürrem's marriage to Suleiman set a new precedent. After her, other sultans would marry, and their wives and mothers would play key roles in court politics. In this sense, she was a trailblazer, altering the very structure of dynastic rule. Her charitable works cemented her as more than just a palace schemer. The Haseki Hürrem Sultan complex in Istanbul remained a hub of social welfare for centuries, feeding the poor and housing travellers. In Jerusalem, her public baths and aqueduct repairs became landmarks of her generosity. These acts of piety softened her image, reminding future generations that she was not only a power broker, but also a benefactor whose wealth served the public good. Yet her reputation abroad took on a more sinister cast. European envoys dubbed her Roxolana, painting her as a seductress who bewitched Suleiman and led him astray from reason. Plays, operas, and novels in the West often portrayed her as the archetype of the dangerous, ambitious woman, a trope that both fascinated and frightened audiences. To them, she embodied the exotic danger of the Ottoman court, where love and politics intertwined with lethal consequences. For modern historians, Hürrem is more than legend. She is evidence of how personal relationships could shape empires, how a woman once sold in a slave market could rise to alter the fate of nations. Her story is a reminder that power in history is not always wielded with swords and armies. Sometimes it rests in whispered counsel, letters sent across borders, and the determination of one extraordinary woman. Hürrem Sultan began life as a captive, but she ended it as an empress in all but name. Her shadow lingered long after her death, not just in Suleiman's grief, but in the empire she helped shape. Her name, whether praised or cursed, would never be forgotten. In ancient Greece, music was not considered a pastime. It was thought to be a force that flowed directly from the gods. Every sound, every rhythm, every melody was believed to carry divine power, capable of shaping the human soul and even influencing the order of the cosmos. According to myth, Apollo, the god of light and harmony, wielded the lyre as his sacred instrument, while the rustic god Pan breathed life into the reed pipes. Hermes, ever mischievous, was said to have invented the lyre by stretching strings across a tortoise shell. In this way, music's origin story was divine, its authority unquestionable. From this divine beginning, music seeped into every aspect of Greek culture. At religious festivals, hymns were sung in honor of the gods. In theatres, choruses used song to echo the emotions of the drama unfolding on stage. Warriors marched into battle to the steady beat of flutes and drums, while farmers sang work songs to keep their labour in rhythm with the seasons. For the Greeks, life without music was not life at all. It was as essential as bread, wine, and olive oil. Yet music was not only entertainment or ritual, it was philosophy made audible. The early philosopher Pythagoras famously argued that music reflected the mathematics of the universe. By plucking strings and listening to the ratios between their tones, he believed he had uncovered the same laws that governed the movements of the planets. To him, music was proof that the cosmos itself was a harmony, a grand composition in which each human being played a part. This fusion of myth, ritual, and philosophy meant that music was woven into identity. Greek children learned songs before they could read, absorbing not just melodies, but also moral lessons embedded within lyrics. Poets like Homer used rhythm and meter to preserve epic tales, ensuring they could be passed down through generations even in a largely oral culture. So when we speak of the origins of Greek music, we are really speaking about the origins of Greek civilization itself. The lyre, the aulos, and the human voice were more than instruments. They were the threads binding people to their gods, to their communities, and to the very structure of the universe. Music wasn't an art form, it was the heartbeat of a culture. When we imagine the soundscape of ancient Greece, three instruments rise above all others: the lyre, the aulos, and the kithara. Each carried not only a distinct tone, but also a cultural weight, symbolizing different aspects of Greek life. The lyre, perhaps the most iconic, was lightweight, portable, and played by both amateurs and professionals. Its structure was simple: a wooden frame with strings stretched across, plucked gently by the fingers, or with a plectrum. But its cultural resonance was immense. The lyre was associated with education, poetry, and refinement. Young boys were taught to play it as part of their schooling, not just to make music, but to instill discipline and harmony in their characters. In Greek eyes, to strum the lyre was to align one's soul with order itself, echoing the balance of the cosmos. The aulos, on the other hand, was a very different beast. A double-reeded pipe, it produced a piercing, almost haunting sound. Unlike the delicate strumming of the lyre, the aulos demanded breath and force, its tones described as wild, ecstatic, even intoxicating. It was often used in religious ceremonies, particularly those devoted to Dionysus, the god of wine, revelry, and madness. To hear the aulos was to be swept into frenzy, to let the body move beyond reason. Its associations with passion and release balanced the lyre's association with order and logic, reflecting the duality that ran through Greek thought. Then came the kithara, a larger, more complex relative of the lyre, used by professional musicians. Its deeper resonance and grander size made it suitable for performances in theatres and competitions. Kithara players, often highly trained and celebrated, were closer to rock stars than humble schoolboys. They competed in musical contests held at festivals where prestige and patronage awaited the best performers. Together, these instruments painted a spectrum of Greek ideals. The lyre represented education and rationality, the aulos unleashed emotion and ecstasy, and the kithara elevated performance into a public spectacle. To the Greeks, music was not confined to a single mood or function. It could soothe, intoxicate, or inspire, depending on the instrument chosen. In this harmony of strings and pipes, Greece discovered the many faces of music, structured, wild, and majestic. Each instrument was more than wood or reed. It was a voice in the ongoing dialogue between order and chaos, reason and passion. In ancient Greece, music was not an optional luxury. It was stitched into the rhythm of daily existence. From the moment a child entered the world until their final rites, music was present, shaping the way Greeks thought, celebrated, and even mourned. Education was one of the first stages where music showed its importance. Greek boys, particularly in the city-states of Athens and Sparta, were expected to learn music as part of their training. Alongside literacy and athletics, lyre lessons were a standard feature of schooling. To the Greeks, music educated more than the hands or the voice. It educated the soul. A child who played the lyre was thought to develop balance, self-control, and sensitivity to harmony, qualities that would later help him govern himself, and ideally, his city. Music was moral training disguised as melody. Ritual life was another arena where music dominated. Hymns to the gods echoed in temples, accompanied by flutes, lyres, and choral singing. Processions and festivals were incomplete without musicians leading the way, their rhythms keeping crowds in step. Some rituals required more than melody. They demanded frenzy. In Dionysian festivals, the piercing cry of the aulos drove dancers into ecstatic trances, blurring the line between human and divine. In contrast, the solemn hymns sung to Apollo represented order, purity, and clarity. In these opposites, the Greeks expressed the full range of their relationship with the gods, sometimes rational, sometimes ecstatic, always musical. The theatre, however, was where music revealed its true cultural power. Greek drama was never silent. Tragedies and comedies were performed with choruses that sang, danced, and commented on the action. These choruses were not background music. They were integral storytellers, shaping how the audience experienced the narrative. A tragic chorus might lament the fate of a doomed hero, while a comic chorus could mock politicians or gods with satirical songs. Music carried emotion in ways words alone could not, amplifying the drama into something unforgettable. Everywhere the Greeks turned, music was there, in classrooms, temples, processions, and theatres. It wasn't a separate art form. It was a mirror of society itself, reflecting its values, anxieties, and aspirations. To live in ancient Greece was to live in a world where every note carried meaning, where rhythm and melody shaped both private virtue and public life. Few ideas capture the Greek view of music better than the belief that melody was not just sound, but mathematics made audible. At the centre of this vision stood Pythagoras, the philosopher-mathematician whose fascination with numbers changed how the Greeks, and later the world, understood harmony. Legend tells us that Pythagoras, passing by a blacksmith's forge, noticed how different hammers produced different tones when they struck metal. The heavier the hammer, the lower the pitch. The lighter, the higher. This observation led him to experiment with strings. For Pythagoras, this was no accident. It was proof that music obeyed universal laws, the same laws that governed mathematics and the cosmos. From this insight grew the concept of the harmony of the spheres. The Greeks imagined the planets and stars moving across the heavens in perfect ratios, like notes plucked on a divine lyre. Though inaudible to human ears, the universe itself was thought to be singing, an eternal cosmic symphony that echoed through existence. To contemplate music, then, was to glimpse the structure of reality. This blending of numbers and notes had practical consequences. Musicians began to tune their instruments using Pythagorean ratios, embedding mathematical precision into performance. Philosophers, meanwhile, saw music as a tool for moral education. If the cosmos itself was harmonious, then a well-ordered life should be too. To play music correctly was to train the soul to align with universal balance. Plato took this further in his writings, arguing that music had the power to shape character and even political order. A society that encouraged noble, disciplined melodies would produce noble, disciplined citizens. On the other hand, music that was chaotic or indulgent could corrupt morals and destabilize cities. For the Greeks, tuning an instrument was not merely technical, it was ethical, even political. So when Pythagoras plucked a string, he wasn't just making music, he was revealing what the Greeks believed to be the very language of the cosmos. Every note was a number, every harmony a law of nature, every rhythm a reflection of eternal order. In this worldview, music wasn't entertainment, it was the sound of truth itself. For the Greeks, music was more than art or philosophy, it was medicine. They believed that melody and rhythm could restore harmony to the human body and soul, just as tuning a lyre restored balance to its strings. Where modern medicine prescribes pills, the Greeks might prescribe a song. This belief had roots in both myth and practice. The god Apollo embodied the dual roles of music and healing, serving as both patron of the lyre and master of medicine. His son Asclepius, worshipped as the god of healing, was often honoured with hymns in sanctuaries where the sick sought cures. The connection was clear. To heal was to harmonise, and music was the divine bridge between chaos and order, illness and health. Philosophers reinforced this view. Pythagoras, whose mathematical ratios shaped musical theory, also applied them to health. He taught that the body was like an instrument. Disease was a kind of dissonance, while healing meant restoring proper harmony. His followers claimed that certain scales and rhythms could calm anger, ease pain, or encourage sleep. The disordered mind could be soothed by ordered melody. Even Plato and Aristotle, usually cautious in their judgments, acknowledged music's therapeutic power. Plato suggested that modes of music, like the Dorian or Phrygian, could instill courage, moderation, or tranquility, effectively training the soul as a physician trains the body. Aristotle, more pragmatic, observed that music could purge emotions through catharsis, a cleansing release that left listeners healthier in spirit. This was not abstract theory alone. In healing sanctuaries such as Epidaurus, patients often encountered music alongside baths, dream therapy, and herbal remedies. Flutes and lyres accompanied rituals meant to calm the sick, while chants and hymns lifted spirits. Music was not simply background noise, it was treatment. The Greeks even extended the idea to society at large. Just as music could restore balance to an individual, it could heal a community torn by conflict. Songs at festivals and theatre performances offered collective catharsis, aligning the emotions of many into one harmonious whole. Healing, they believed, was not only personal, but communal. For the Greeks, then, music was medicine for both body and soul. To listen was to align with harmony. To sing was to heal oneself and others. In their world, the doctor's tools were not only scalpels and herbs, but also flutes, choruses, and the divine echo of Apollo's lyre. In ancient Greece, music was not merely an offering to the gods, it was their language. Every strum of the lyre, every note of the aulos, was thought to be a form of prayer, a bridge between mortal and divine. Festivals, sacrifices, and mysteries all pulsed with music, without which rituals would have been unthinkable. Apollo, the god most closely associated with music, symbolized order, clarity, and harmony. His sacred instrument, the lyre, accompanied hymns sung at temples and festivals held in his honor, such as the Pythian Games at Delphi. These competitions were not just athletic, but also musical, with poets and musicians vying for prizes beneath the gaze of the god. To play the lyre was not entertainment, it was devotion, an attempt to echo Apollo's perfect balance. Dionysus, in contrast, brought out the wild, ecstatic side of Greek religion. His worshippers filled the hills with the frenzied wail of the aulos and the pounding of drums. The Bacchic rituals performed at night often involved dancers losing themselves in rhythm, wine, and trance, blurring the boundary between human and divine. Where Apollo's music sought order, Dionysus's called for release, a reminder that the gods embodied both balance and chaos, reason and passion. Other deities too were tied to music. The Muses, 9 goddesses of inspiration, presided over song, dance, and poetry, guiding artists to higher creation. Musicians invoked them before performances, believing that without divine aid, true art could not exist. Hermes, the trickster, was credited with inventing the lyre itself, transforming a tortoise shell into the first resonating body. Even Ares, the god of war, was honoured with rhythmic chants and battle songs meant to stir soldiers' courage. Rituals of everyday worship reflected this divine connection. Libations poured to the gods were accompanied by hymns. Processions to temples marched to flute music. Funeral rites used laments sung by women, giving voice to grief and guiding the soul of the departed toward the underworld. Music was not decoration. It was the medium through which Greeks communicated with powers greater than themselves. In myth and ritual alike, music revealed its sacred role. It was a gift from the gods, an offering back to them, and the soundscape through which divine and human worlds met. For the Greeks, to make music was to touch the eternal. If temples and festivals revealed music's sacred side, daily Greek society revealed its social power. Music accompanied not only worship, but also wine, conversation, and civic life. It was entertainment, education, and persuasion all at once, a tool that shaped citizens as much as it delighted them. Nowhere was this clearer than at the symposium, the Greek drinking party. After the serious business of the meal, guests reclined on couches, sipping wine, debating philosophy, and singing songs together. These were not random ditties but structured performances, sometimes solo, sometimes choral, often accompanied by the lyre or kithara. Poetry and music blended seamlessly, with verses praising love, mocking politicians, or reflecting on mortality. The symposium made music into a bonding ritual, a way to unify elites through shared rhythm and melody, while also testing wit and creativity. The theatre, however, was where music became the voice of the people. In Athens, tragedies and comedies unfolded with choruses that danced and sang their way across the stage. The chorus commented on the drama, guided audience emotion, and reminded citizens of moral lessons. Their melodies carried the weight of collective conscience, amplifying the playwright's message. For example, when Aeschylus staged battles or Euripides staged grief, it was the chorus's music that transformed words into an immersive civic experience. Music also had a political dimension. Greek thinkers argued that the modes of music, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, carried distinct effects on character. Plato claimed that noble modes should be promoted by the state to foster discipline and virtue, while indulgent ones should be banned for corrupting the citizenry. This wasn't abstract theory. City-states actively debated the role of music in education and governance, treating it as a matter of public policy. To the Greeks, a well-tuned lyre could produce not just harmony in sound, but harmony in the polis itself. Even in military settings, music shaped society. Soldiers marched to flute players, their steps aligned by rhythm, their spirits stirred by song. The beat kept armies disciplined, while chants and paeans raised morale before battle. Music turned groups of individuals into unified collectives, whether in war, theatre, or symposium. Thus, Greek society was saturated with music. It was the soundtrack of private leisure, the pulse of civic festivals, and the rhythm of politics and war. To be Greek was to live not only among marble columns and olive groves, but also among melodies that defined community itself. To the Greeks, music was never trivial. It was a force that shaped minds, moulded citizens, and even guided governments. education without music was unthinkable, because melody was believed to train not only the ear but also the character. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle treated music as seriously as mathematics or ethics, placing it at the centre of their visions of an ideal society. For Plato, music was a tool for the soul. In the Republic, he argued that the right musical modes could instill courage, moderation and discipline in young people, while the wrong modes might encourage laziness, indulgence, or even rebellion. He wasn't just speculating about taste, he believed music could literally form or deform moral character. To him, a well-governed city required well-governed melodies. Change the music, he warned, and you risk changing the very laws of the state. In this sense, music was not entertainment, but social engineering. Aristotle, while less rigid, echoed the same concerns. In politics, he acknowledged music's pleasure, but insisted that its real value lay in education. He observed that music could provide catharsis, purging emotions in a healthy way. By listening to certain melodies, people could release anger, grief, or fear, achieving a balanced state of mind. For Aristotle, the benefit of music was twofold. It cultivated virtue when studied seriously, and it soothed the soul when enjoyed casually. Both functions, he believed, made it indispensable to a flourishing life. Outside philosophy, music was woven into actual schooling. Athenian boys learned to play the lyre alongside their studies of poetry and gymnastics, ensuring they grew into balanced citizens, both strong in body and refined in spirit. In Sparta, music had a more martial role. Songs were used to train discipline and unity, with choirs of boys and men singing in public festivals that reinforced communal identity. Whether gentle or severe, education across Greece acknowledged music as an essential civic tool. This integration of music into philosophy and pedagogy reveals just how seriously the Greeks took harmony. For them, teaching a child to pluck strings or sing verses was not a luxury. It was a necessity for producing virtuous citizens and stable states. The lyre and the aulos were not toys. They were instruments of moral architecture. To study music was to study the soul itself, and to neglect it was, in the Greek imagination, to risk chaos both within and without. Though the lyres and auloi of ancient Greece have long fallen silent, their echoes shaped the music of the ancient world and beyond. Greek theories of harmony, rhythm, and education did not vanish with the decline of the city-states. They were inherited, adapted, and preserved by later cultures, ensuring that Greek music remained a foundation of Western thought. Rome was the first heir. The Romans admired Greek culture, and when they absorbed Greece into their empire, they imported its music wholesale. Greek instruments became Roman instruments. Greek musicians, often enslaved or hired, filled Roman theatres and banquets. The kithara and the aulos found new life in Roman spectacles, where music accompanied gladiatorial games, public ceremonies, and private entertainments. Yet it was Greek philosophy about music that most deeply impressed Roman thinkers. Writers like Cicero and Seneca echoed Plato and Aristotle, treating music as a tool for shaping morality and self-control. Beyond Rome, Greek ideas about music survived through the writings of philosophers and mathematicians. The Pythagorean notion that harmony reflected mathematical ratios influenced not only medieval scholars, but also Renaissance scientists like Kepler, who revived the music of the spheres to describe planetary motion. The belief that the universe was structured as a kind of grand symphony carried across centuries, from ancient Greece to the birth of modern astronomy. Greek modes and scales also provided the backbone for later Western musical traditions. Early Christian hymns were influenced by Greek musical practice, and Byzantine chant preserved elements of ancient theory. When medieval Europe began formalizing music theory, scholars turned back to Greek texts for guidance, rediscovering Aristotle and Pythagoras through Arabic and Latin translations. Even the basic language we use for music today, harmony, rhythm, mode, owes its origins to Greek thought. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of Greek music lies in its philosophy. The idea that music is more than sound, that it can heal, instruct, and elevate the soul. This conviction shaped education for millennia and still lingers in how we speak of music therapy, soulful performances, or harmonious societies. The Greeks taught us that music is not just art, it is order, passion, and meaning woven into sound. So while the instruments may be lost, the legacy of Greek music endures. It shaped Rome, it inspired the Middle Ages, it influenced the Renaissance, and it continues to hum beneath the foundations of Western culture. The Greeks may be gone, but their music still plays, silently, within the very structure of how we understand the world. Joan of Arc's story begins in 1412, in the small farming village of Domremy in northeastern France. The land was quiet, the kind of place where generations of peasants tilled the soil, tended animals, and rarely travelled beyond the nearest market town. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer of modest means, and her mother Isabel was known locally for her piety. By all accounts, Joan grew up like countless other village children, helping in the fields, spinning wool, and learning her prayers. But her childhood was shadowed by war. France at the time was fractured by the 100 Years' War, a conflict with England that had dragged on for decades. Northern towns were burned, armies marched through villages, and even children grew up knowing that their country's future hung by a thread. The rightful French heir, Charles of Valois, had not yet been crowned, while large parts of France were occupied by the English and their Burgundian allies. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and suffering that Joan began to hear her voices. Around the age of 13, while working in her father's garden, Joan claimed to see a bright light and hear a voice. She later identified it as Saint Michael, the archangel, who told her to remain pure and prepare for a divine mission. Over time, she reported visits from St. Catherine and St. Margaret as well, who urged her to protect France and restore its rightful king. For Joan, these were not passing dreams or vague feelings. They were commands from heaven, crystal clear in her mind. In a village where most people never learned to read or write, Joan's insistence on having direct communication with saints was extraordinary. Her neighbours thought her unusually devout, but they also noticed her confidence. She did not speak of her visions with hesitation, but with certainty, as if she had been chosen. For Joan, the voices were both a comfort and a burden. They gave her a sense of destiny far beyond her years, but they also placed on her shoulders the impossible task of saving a nation. She was still only a teenage peasant girl, yet she believed with unwavering conviction that God had chosen her for something monumental. Thus, from the humblest beginnings, a farmer's daughter began her path toward becoming France's unlikely saviour. By the time Joan of Arc reached 16, her visions had grown more insistent. The voices of Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret no longer spoke only of faith and purity. They now demanded action. They told her that France could be saved only if the rightful heir, Charles of Valois, styled Charles VII, was crowned king in Reims. And shockingly, they insisted that she, an illiterate peasant girl, was the one chosen to make it happen. For most in her village of Domremy, the idea was unthinkable. Women did not lead armies, let alone dictate royal policy, but Joan's conviction was unshakable. She believed God had given her a mission to drive the English from France and see Charles crowned. Refusing to ignore the call, she sought a way to reach him. Her opportunity came when she travelled to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs, controlled by a local supporter of Charles. There she petitioned Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander, asking for an escort to bring her to the Dauphin. At first, he laughed her off. What use could a teenage farm girl possibly have in the affairs of kings and generals? But Joan refused to leave. She returned again and again, speaking with calm determination, insisting that her mission was divine. Slowly, her persistence and sincerity began to impress those around her. Local villagers vouched for her piety and honesty. When Joan revealed knowledge of a French defeat near Orléans before news of it had reached the region, some began to suspect that perhaps her voices were genuine. Whether by miracle, rumour, or sheer coincidence, the impression stuck. Baudricourt finally relented. In early 1429, he agreed to send Joan to Charles. Disguised in men's clothing for protection on the dangerous journey, she rode across war-torn France accompanied by a small escort. The image of a teenage girl in armour-like attire, claiming a divine mission, must have seemed surreal. Yet her determination inspired those who travelled with her. After 11 days on horseback, Joan arrived at Chinon, where Charles was holding court. The girl from Domremy, who had never been more than a peasant's daughter, now stood on the threshold of history, ready to convince a hesitant prince that God had sent her to save his crown. When Joan of Arc arrived at Chinon in early 1429, she faced her greatest test yet. Charles, the Dauphin of France, was desperate for hope but cautious of deception. France was losing the war, his claim to the throne was disputed, and his court was riddled with doubt. Could this young peasant girl, barely 17, truly be sent by God to rescue him? Charles decided to test her. A meeting was arranged in the grand hall of the castle, but to challenge Joan's supposed divine insight, he concealed himself among the courtiers. Another man, dressed in regal clothes, was placed on the throne to pose as the Dauphin. The expectation was simple. If Joan mistook the decoy for the real Charles, her credibility would collapse instantly. But when Joan entered the hall, she did not hesitate. Ignoring the figure on the throne, she walked straight through the crowd and bowed to Charles, who stood disguised among the nobles. "Gentle Dauphin," she is said to have declared, "God has sent me to aid you and your kingdom." The court was stunned. For Charles, surrounded by skeptics, it was a moment of awe. Whether by intuition, rumour, or divine guidance, Joan had passed her first trial. Charles was intrigued, but he needed more than theatrics. He arranged for Joan to be examined by churchmen at Poitiers, where her virginity, piety, and knowledge of faith were rigorously tested. The clerics, expecting to find a fraud, instead concluded that there was nothing heretical about her claims. She was declared a devout and virtuous maiden, untainted by corruption. Her voices, they argued, could not be dismissed outright. In private, Joan also gave Charles a sign that convinced him of her sincerity. Sources differ on what exactly she revealed. Some claim she repeated a secret prayer he had once offered to God, others that she disclosed doubts he had never shared aloud. Whatever it was, it shook Charles to the core. From that moment he treated her mission with seriousness. Still, not everyone in the court was persuaded. Many nobles scoffed at the idea of following a teenage girl into battle. But Charles, hesitant by nature, had little else to cling to. Against all odds, he agreed to grant Joan armour, a sword, and a command. The girl from Domremy was about to step onto the battlefield, not as a mere messenger, but as a leader of men. When Joan of Arc first rode toward Orléans in April 1429, the city was on the brink of collapse. For months, English forces had surrounded it, choking off supplies and morale. The fall of Orléans would have been catastrophic for France, cementing English dominance and leaving Charles VII little hope of reclaiming his crown. To many, it seemed only a matter of time before the city surrendered. Into this desperate situation came Joan, a teenage girl clad in white armour, bearing a banner instead of a sword. Her arrival electrified the defenders. She spoke with absolute confidence, proclaiming that God had sent her to deliver the city. Soldiers who had been weary and demoralised suddenly felt a surge of courage. Chroniclers recorded that Joan rode through the streets promising victory, lifting spirits not with strategy alone, but with faith. She embodied hope at a moment when hope seemed impossible. Though she was not a trained commander, Joan was fearless in the field. She rode at the front lines, carrying her banner high, urging men to press forward when hesitation set in. She scolded the mercenaries for swearing, demanded discipline, and insisted that the army attend confession and mass before battle. To her, the fight was not merely military, it was sacred. The turning point came on May 7th, when the French launched an assault on the Tourelle, the strongest English fortification guarding the bridge into the city. In the thick of the fighting, Joan was struck by an arrow that pierced her shoulder. For a moment, panic rippled through the French ranks, but instead of retreating, Joan pulled the arrow out herself, returned to the front, and raised her banner once more. The sight of her, bloodied but unbroken, inspired the soldiers to storm the fort. By evening, the English were in retreat. The very next day, the siege was lifted. Against all expectation, Orléans was free. News of the victory spread like wildfire across France. To the faithful, it was a miracle. To skeptics, an unexplainable reversal of fortune. Either way, Joan had done what seasoned generals had failed to achieve. In the eyes of many, the peasant girl from Domremy had proven herself chosen, not just by Charles, but by God. The legend of the Maid of Orléans was born. The victory at Orléans transformed Joan of Arc from a curious figure into a national heroine. For Charles VII, it was more than a battlefield win. It was a sign that perhaps God truly favoured his cause. Yet Joan knew that lifting a siege was not enough. The voices that guided her were clear. Charles must be crowned king at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations. Only then would his claim be sealed in the eyes of his people. This was no simple task. Reims lay deep in enemy-held territory, surrounded by English and Burgundian strongholds. The journey itself seemed suicidal. Yet Joan pressed Charles to act, insisting that delay would only invite doubt. Her conviction was contagious. Where courtiers hesitated, she demanded boldness. Eventually, Charles agreed. In June 1429, a royal army began its march northward, with Joan riding at its head, banner in hand. Along the way, something extraordinary happened. Towns that had been loyal to the English began to open their gates. Some surrendered without a fight, swayed by Joan's reputation as God's chosen messenger. Others were persuaded by her direct appeals, as she rode to their walls and promised mercy if they joined the king's cause. The campaign became less a march of conquest than a pilgrimage of persuasion. When the army finally reached Reims, the city welcomed them without resistance. On July 17, 1429, Charles was anointed with holy oil in the great cathedral, with Joan standing proudly beside him. For years, the Dauphin had been mocked as a weak and uncertain claimant, but now he was King Charles VII of France, crowned in the very place where generations of monarchs had been consecrated. For Joan, this was the fulfillment of her mission, or at least part of it. She had taken a boy king who seemed destined for obscurity and placed him on the throne through faith, determination, and sheer audacity. Chroniclers wrote that she wept with joy during the ceremony, declaring that God's will had been accomplished. Yet even in triumph, the road ahead was fraught with danger. The English were far from defeated, and political intrigue still threatened Charles's fragile authority. For Joan, the voices that had guided her since childhood would soon demand even greater sacrifices. The coronation was not the end of her story, but the turning point that made her fall all the more tragic. The coronation at Reims in July 1429 should have been Joan of Arc's crowning achievement. Yet triumph quickly gave way to frustration. Joan urged Charles VII to press on and reclaim Paris, but the king, cautious and swayed by advisers who distrusted her, hesitated. When an assault was finally attempted, it faltered, leaving Paris in English hands. For Joan, who believed delay was dangerous, the setback was crushing. Still, her voices urged her to fight on. In the months that followed, Joan continued to lead smaller campaigns, but her influence at court began to wane. The same nobles who had once celebrated her victories now grumbled about her growing fame. To some, she was a threat, a peasant girl overshadowing seasoned commanders. To others, she was a nuisance, constantly urging the king to act with a boldness they did not share. Political jealousy and suspicion began to erode her position. By 1430, Joan had turned her attention north to Compiègne, a city under siege by the Burgundians, allies of the English. Determined to defend it, she rode into battle once again, clad in armour and carrying her banner. On May 23rd, during a skirmish outside the city walls, disaster struck. As the French retreated, Joan was trapped outside the gates. When she tried to fight her way back, the drawbridge was raised. Whether out of panic, confusion, or betrayal remains unclear. Abandoned and surrounded, she was pulled from her horse and captured. Her captors, the Burgundians, knew her value. To them, she was not just a prisoner of war, but a bargaining chip. The English, humiliated by her victories and desperate to discredit her, paid a large ransom for her transfer. Joan was handed over, not to her king, but to her enemies. Charles VII, the man whose crown she had secured, made no move to rescue her. Whether bound by political calculation, lack of resources, or simple fear, he left her to face her fate alone. For Joan, the sense of betrayal must have been bitter. She had given everything. Her youth, her safety, her very identity, for France and its king. And now, at the moment of her greatest need, she was abandoned. The Maid of Orleans, once hailed as God's chosen saviour, was now a prisoner in English hands, and her trial, unlike her battles, would be fought not with banners and swords, but with words and accusations in a hostile court. After her capture, Joan of Arc was delivered to Rouen, the English stronghold in Normandy. There, her enemies prepared a different kind of battlefield, one with no swords or banners, only clerics, judges, and scribes. Her trial was designed not to seek truth, but to destroy her reputation, discredit Charles VII's coronation, and prove that she was no divinely inspired heroine, but a heretic and a witch. The proceedings began in January 1431, overseen by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a staunch supporter of the English. From the start, the trial was stacked against her. Joan, only 19, was denied legal counsel, isolated from her supporters, and interrogated for hours on end. The clerics questioned her visions, her wearing of men's clothing, and her claim that she acted on God's will. Each question was meant to trap her, to force her into contradicting herself or admitting blasphemy. Yet Joan held her ground with astonishing composure. Illiterate though she was, she outwitted university-trained theologians with quick, sharp answers. When pressed on whether she was in God's grace, a question designed to condemn her no matter the answer, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." Her response silenced the court. It was both humble and unassailable, a refusal to let her accusers dictate the terms of her faith. Her voices, she insisted, had always guided her with purity and truth. She denied accusations of sorcery, maintaining that her mission came from God alone. Even under threat of torture, she refused to recant. Her wearing of men's clothing, she argued, was for protection among soldiers, an answer both practical and defiant in an age when cross-dressing was seen as sinful. Despite her courage, the outcome was predetermined. The English needed her condemned. For months they ground her down with endless interrogations, hoping exhaustion would force mistakes. At times, Joan faltered. She signed a brief abjuration under pressure, but soon after, she returned to her men's clothes and her unwavering stance. Her judges seized on this as relapse, sealing her fate. In the end, the trial was less about Joan herself than about power. By branding her a heretic, the English sought to undermine Charles's legitimacy and erase the miracle of Reims. But Joan's defiance ensured that, even in chains, her voice remained stronger than their accusations. On May 30th, 1431, the story of Joan of Arc reached its grim climax in the marketplace of Rouen. After months of interrogation and a trial engineered to condemn her, she was declared a relapsed heretic. The sentence was death by fire, a punishment meant not only to kill her, but to erase her legacy, to turn her into an example of what happened to those who dared challenge English power or church authority. That morning, Joan was led from her cell. She was only 19, a teenager who had once ridden at the head of armies, now shackled and surrounded by guards. Eyewitnesses said she wept and prayed as she walked, asking for a cross to hold. An English soldier, moved despite himself, fashioned one from 2 sticks and handed it to her. Another was brought from a nearby church and held high before her eyes as she mounted the scaffold. Even her enemies could not deny the intensity of her faith. The crowd that gathered was immense. Townsfolk, soldiers, clerics, all pressed together to witness the death of the Maid of Orleans. Some came to jeer, others to mourn, and many simply to watch history unfold. Joan, bound to the stake, asked the priests to recite prayers aloud so that her final words might be carried heavenward. Over and over, she cried the name of Jesus. When the flames were lit, smoke rose and fire crackled around her. Chroniclers record that even hardened soldiers turned away, unable to bear the sight. Some swore they saw a dove rise above the fire as she died, a symbol of her soul ascending. Others whispered that her heart remained unburned when her ashes were scattered, fueling the belief that God himself had protected a part of her. For the English, the execution was supposed to be the end of her legend, a humiliating spectacle to erase her victories and discredit Charles VII's coronation. Yet it had the opposite effect. To many in France, Joan died as a martyr, her courage unbroken even in the face of flames. Her prayer-filled death left an impression so powerful that even some of her enemies admitted she had been unjustly condemned. That day in Rouen, the English destroyed her body, but they could not extinguish her story. If anything, the fire only ensured that the Maid of Orleans would blaze brighter in memory than she ever had in life. When the flames at Rouen died down, Joan of Arc's body was reduced to ashes, her name blackened by accusations of heresy. Yet almost immediately, her story began to slip beyond the control of her enemies. In France, whispers spread that the maid had been executed unjustly, that she had died faithful and fearless, and that her sacrifice had sanctified Charles VII's crown. What was meant to be her erasure became the seed of her legend. In the years following her death, Charles VII slowly consolidated power. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over and the English expelled from most of France. The king owed much of his legitimacy to the coronation at Reims, a coronation Joan had made possible. But curiously, he did little to defend her memory during her lifetime. Only after victory was secure did her rehabilitation begin. In 1456, at the request of Joan's family, the church launched a retrial. Witnesses were called, records examined, and the original proceedings scrutinized. The verdict was damning, not for Joan, but for her judges. The retrial declared her innocent, her trial corrupt, and her execution a miscarriage of justice. Joan was officially cleared of heresy, her name restored, and her reputation elevated. She was no longer a heretic, but a martyr of faith and patriotism. Her legend only grew with time. To the French, she became a symbol of national unity, the peasant girl who had risen above kings and generals to save her country. Writers and poets immortalized her. Artists painted her in shining armor. Dramatists turned her story into myth. Even her enemies grudgingly acknowledged the power of her tale. Centuries later, the church itself recognized her sanctity. In 1909, Joan was beatified, and in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by Pope Benedict XV. The peasant girl once condemned to flames now stood in the company of saints, her feast day celebrated worldwide. Joan of Arc's life remains a paradox, both fragile and indomitable, both political pawn and divine visionary. She lived only 19 years, yet altered the course of a nation's history. Burned as a heretic, she rose as a saint. Her legacy endures not just in churches and cathedrals, but in the enduring belief that faith, courage, and conviction can change the fate of the world.